Today is the Sunday of Orthodoxy, otherwise known as the Triumph of Orthodoxy. And I just want to speak a little bit about that and what kind of that means. And before you dive in, when you talk about this feast day, you have to talk about kind of what happened. Very briefly, I'm going to just explain kind of why we're celebrating what we're celebrating. So in the 700s, from 717 to 842, beginning in the reign of Leo the Isaurian and ending in the reign of Theophilos, there was an iconoclastic conflict. There were people that were persecuting the church and destroying icons. And so, thank God, after a while, the emperor at the time passed away, Theophilos, and his widow, the Empress Theodora, venerated the icon of the Mother of God in the presence of the Patriarch Methodius, St. Methodius the Confessor, and St. Theodora the Empress, and within other people and around other people, and they confessed the true faith, and they venerated icons. And she famously said, quote, "If anyone does not offer relative worship to the holy icons, not adoring them as though they were gods, but venerating them out of love as images of the archetype, let him be anathema, let him be excommunicated." That's a fancy word for excommunicated. So after this kind of declaration of the beauty of icons and how we should venerate icons, every first Sunday of the fast, they did a procession and they adored the icons. They celebrated the end of this iconoclastic period. And so it is of course, for historical reasons, why we kind of continue this way of processing the icons, which you'll witness today after liturgy. But when I was thinking about kind of what to talk about, it's interesting when you think about this feast. There's two reasons why it's, in my opinion. The first reason is the historical reason. Why are we celebrating this today? Why at the beginning of Lent are we celebrating this today? And of course, the first reason is historical. The second reason, and I would argue the more important reason, is that it's the season of penitential. It's a penitential season. And so it's appropriate to meditate on what it means to be the image of God. And what do I mean by that? There are tons of icons around you, made by hand. Made by hand. But there's also tons of icons around you not made by hand. Each of us are icons not made by hand. And sometimes we treat, not sometimes, 99.9% of the time, we treat icons made by hand better than icons made not by hand. We treat each other worse than we treat the veneration of icons. And so for us, it's a good time to reflect on why that is, what's going on. And part of that is this society that we live in. We live in a society in our day and age that has seen a significant increase in the self. My hurts, my self-esteem, what works for me. It's all me-centered, right? And so the world is more interested in serving itself than its fellow neighbor. And that's shown, it doesn't take long to find this in our day and age. It doesn't take long to see this. In the war between Ukraine and Russia, we see this. This is coming from a place of egoism. It's coming from a place of self-centeredness and power. It's not coming from a place of love and self-sacrifice. We see this in our day, in our work, in our home, and even in our church, in our church building. People choose themselves over each other. And this action of thinking of ourselves first is not just a denial of one of them, but it's a denial of Christ. It's a denial of the image of each of us, of Christ within each of us. So when we deny our neighbor, we're directly denying Christ, and not after the fact, not secondarily. We are directly denying Christ. And so whenever I think about this concept of kind of how we're all images of Christ and how we deny each other, how we deny Christ, the image that I think of is this icon right here. This icon right here is an icon of the face of Christ, if you can't see. And it was originally hand-painted by the famous iconographer and theologian Photios Kontoglou. And it's one of my favorite icons. The reason is, traditionally, he painted it as the face that Christ made after St. Peter denied him the third time. While Christ was being tried by the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees, and Peter was on the outskirts of the city, and he denied Christ 3 times, and the cock crowed. And this is the face that Christ traditionally made. So whenever I think of the denial of Christ, I always think of this beautiful, stern, yet disappointed face. But it's disappointing, but it's loving, and it's this face of love, and it kind of strikes the viewer. It strikes the beholder to the very core. And so when we deny each other, we're denying Christ. In Psalm 50, in verse 4, it says, "Against you only have I sinned." What does this sin against God consist of? What does this mean? It's not necessarily meaning that David the psalmist denied Christ, but he denied his neighbor. It's precisely the sin against his neighbor, and in so doing, a sin against God. And so while we're kind of reflecting on the denial of Christ and the Sunday of Orthodoxy, and when we're witnessing this beautiful procession and the proclamation of the Synodikon, which is, this proclamation of truth and faith over all of the heresies at that time, and this should be celebrated, and we should be triumphant in Orthodoxy. And in many respects, Orthodoxy will always be triumphant. But while we are in this season of penitence, we need to ask ourselves, are we triumphant in Orthodoxy? Are we triumphant in how we treat one another? Are we triumphant in treating the image of God not made by hand better than the image of God, or on par with, not better, but on par with venerating one another, right? With the images made by hand. Are we triumphing in our spiritual life? And what does it look like to triumph in your spiritual life? It looks like to stay true to Christ, to not deny Christ. That's when you're triumphing in your faith. And so at the beginning of Lent, we have to look at ourselves. Are we denying Christ, or are we triumphing in Christ? Am I denying Christ in my actions towards others? Am I denying Christ in my thoughts about others? Am I denying Christ in my thoughts about myself and in my character, and kicking myself while I'm down? We live in a world that constantly denies Christ and barrages others verbally, and now, as you see, physically, even Christian to Christian, especially Christian to Christian. We're called to a higher standard. We're called to a standard of love, a standard of embrace, a standard that glorifies and venerates the image of God within each of us, not just on a piece of wood. Don't be pulled down to the depths of sin and play in the mud of denial. When we throw stones at one another, or judge one another, or hurt one another, verbally or physically, rise up to the standard that Christ has set for us, and stay true to the Lord by staying true to one another, by honoring and venerating each other, and embracing one another, and so triumph over sin and death. If you do that, then you're on the path that we're called to be on during this Lenten season. May we all learn to love one another, not deny each other the grace that we are so well deserved of through the image of God. God bless you. God give us strength as we learn how to do this. God bless you.